Hello, welcome to this session for Azure Back to School. Today we're looking at big data and moving that data around using Azure and some of the options that Azure has available through Azure Data Factory. My name is Barrett, and I'll be walking you through Azure Data Factory today. And just a little bit about me. I'm currently a manager for Fusion Alliance. It's a consulting firm in the Midwest United States. I lead a team of Dynamics developers, but I also enjoy doing a lot of activities in my off time, including model railroading, developing personal projects, gaming, any type of gaming. Also a husband and father. So in our jobs, as developers, as technologists, we work with a huge amount of data. That data can take many different forms. It might be in databases. It might be in files. It comes from various systems moving back and forth. All kinds of data, whether it's text or images or sound or other kinds of files. We're dealing with a constant stream of data all the time. And a lot of the systems that are out there are not designed to easily transfer that data back and forth between systems. And yet we have to work with a multitude of systems, whether it be an HR system, a CRM, an ERP, whatever it is. We work with a bunch of different systems day to day, and getting that data moved back and forth. In the past, we'd often have to times invest in custom solutions for extracting that data and moving that data back and forth. But over the last, couple of decades, there's been a steady rise in systems that are designed to interact with the other systems that are designed to move that data back and forth to transform it between the various formats. And those systems come in two main varieties. One is called ETL. And ETL stands for Extract, Transform, Load, which basically talks about the order of operations. So the first thing, you're extracting it from one system. You might do some transformations on it, manipulating the data, redacting some data, converting formats, whatever it might be. And then you load it into the destination system. And then the other type of system, which is closely related, and they're generally all considered together, is ELT, which is extract, then load, and then you do the transformation once it's in the destination system. There's generally not a lot of differences between the two systems. Kind of some highlights here. The biggest thing to remember is that with ETLs, you're reliant on a middle tier system to do all of your transformation work. Whether it's an application in the cloud like Azure Data Factory that we're going to look at today, or some other application that pulls that data out, makes some changes to it, and then pushes it into the destination. With ELT, you're dependent on the destination system to do those manipulations for the most part. So there's oftentimes not a middle tier system, or the middle tier system is very minimal. It doesn't move that data back and forth. There are a ton of different platforms out there. There are literally more. I found more than 100, and I've just highlighted some here. And they come in a bunch of different formats. Some are web-based, some are console-based, some are, extensions to other systems, some are, server-based, whatever it might be. There's a ton of different ways in which ELT and ETL platforms have been implemented. And some of them have been around for a very long time. Some are fairly new. Azure Data Factory in particular is relatively recent, just in the last few years. But what are some of the common use cases for moving, that data back and forth? One of the things that you might need is a product recommendation system. So, you take that data that comes in from your customer information, from your sales history, your customer tracking, when you're watching what they're doing on your websites, various product information. And then you take that ETL system, you merge all that data together and you pre-process it, and then you push it out into a product recommendation system. So that, the next time somebody comes onto your shopping platform or maybe for email marketing purposes, you can recommend products that your system thinks that people might be interested in based on what they've done previously. And that kind of ties into the next thing, is the customer targeted marketing system. So you take those recommendations, not just using them on your sales platform when people are visiting, but you're doing the proactive things, sending out those emails, and other forms of communication to recommend things. The next most common usage is data warehouse construction. So you're taking data from a bunch of different systems, you're merging it together, and you're putting it into one system to use for reporting and analysis work. Another one is moving data back and forth between systems, whether it's between your ERP and your warehouse management system, whether it's between your HR system and your enterprise resource platform. Maybe moving back and forth between your customer system, your CMS platform, and your enterprise platform. Whatever it might be, just moving that data back and forth and making sure that it's in the right format to get to its destination. Another thing you might do is log analysis. Applications today generate a huge amount of data, and there are many opportunities for analyzing that data and figuring out what it is your customer's doing, what it is that's going wrong with your system. Log analysis generally, for a lot of us, we use it as a focus to figure out what's broken, to figure out what's not working correctly on our applications, and ETLs and that can help you analyze that data much more quickly to put it into formats that are easy to work with. There's also a lot of data migration stuff that's done, maybe as frequent things. You have a daily file that gets exported and needs to be sent to some other system, or it could be for one-time analysis. I need to do a one-time pull from all my various systems so I can do some analysis or figure out, what might be needful for the future. So data migrations is really the primary purpose of these ETLs. Then, of course, there's type conversions. The data is in one format. Maybe it's a flat file. Maybe it's a CRV file or CSV file, sorry. Maybe it's in a database, Oracle, SQL Server, Mongo, whatever it might be. Maybe it's in Salesforce or some other ERP system or CRM system. You've got all these systems that aren't naturally designed to talk to each other, and you can use these ETL platforms to move that data back and forth to make these systems talk to each other that weren't actually designed to talk to each other. So this is where Data Factory comes in. This is the Azure platform ETL system. It is entirely cloud-based, although you can host portions of it on on-prem servers. In order to do various and to do various things with your on-prem systems, you do have to sometimes install runtimes on various on-prem servers, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Data Factory is primarily a cloud-based system. Its user interface, generally most people will work within the user interface, and we'll do a deeper dive into that in a few minutes. But it's fairly straightforward. It's drag and drop. If you've worked with SSRS packages on SQL Server, it's fairly similar. You just drag something on, you do the configuration, you link them together with success, fail steps and various things. And it just flows from one step to the next until it reaches the end of processing. And here's a simple explanation or a simple example here that I've got on the screen right now. And they can be very simple. They can, maybe it's just simply converting a file from CSV to SQL Server, or they can be fairly complex where you're doing a bunch of transformation, you're doing a lot of air checking, you're manipulating the data, you're redacting PII, whatever it might be. So there are various parts. So the overall flow is called a pipeline in Data Factory. So the pipeline represents the entire process from beginning to end. Within that pipeline, you have various activities. So for instance, the one that's highlighted there is a data flow that converts a CSV to a fixed width file. And each of those individual steps are the various activities. Those activities connect to various pieces of data. And the connection between Data Factory and the data, there are kind of two parts to it. So there's what's called a data set, which is the actual representation of the data itself, whether it's a file, whether it's a table in a database, whether it's the output of a stored procedure, whether it's the data collected from an API, web API, whatever it might be. That's the data set. And then there is the link service, which is the actual connection, where you put your credentials. It represents that connection from Data Factory to Salesforce or from Data Factory to SQL Server. That's called a link service. So there's two basic types of activities that are used to move data back and forth. One is called the copy activity. That is basically a simple copy. You can do some little bit of minor manipulation, but it's basically just moving data from one point to another, from one format to another. And then there's what's called a data flow, which is where you would do more complex manipulation of the data. So whether you need to merge data from multiple sources into a single source or into a single destination, or if you need to, split out data that's coming from various sources or even a single source and split that out into multiple outputs, you would have to use what's called a data flow, which is basically just a more complex implementation of the data of the copy activity. So the data sets represent the actual data. So that might be, a table in SQL Server. It might be a flat file. It might be the output of a stored procedure. It might be the results come back from a web API call. Those are called data sets, the actual representation of the data. And then those data sets are based on what's called linked services. And the linked services are the actual connections. So a connection to blob storage is a linked service. A connection to Cosmos DB is a linked service. Connection to your Amazon S3 instance is a linked service. So the linked service is the actual connection, and then the data set is the data that comes from that connection. And then the last part of Data Factory, the last term that you really need to know is what's called the integration runtimes. These are basically the servers that run the actual steps or run the actual pipelines. So by default, when you create an instance of Data Factory, you get one integration runtime, which is hosted in Azure in the cloud. That's your default runtime. And anything that you don't designate to run on another runtime will run on that default instance. What you can also do, though, is you can add additional instances of the integration runtimes. Those can be either cloud-based in Azure, if you want to, upgrade or expand your performance capabilities. But also if you need to interact with systems that are on your on-premises. So, maybe you have a SQL Server that you're hosting on-prem in your network. Then you need to install an instance of the integration runtimes on a server which sits on your on-prem network. And then that integration runtime can connect to the cloud instances. But in order to touch those servers that are on your on-prem network, you have to have a local integration runtime somewhere on your network, which basically handles the interface between Azure and between your on-prem. And it's a completely secure connection. Once you get it set up, nothing else can ride over that connection. It's used only for Azure Data Factory. So that's kind of it from a high-level view. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to some demonstrations. All right, so here we are in our Azure portal. Okay, so here we are in our Azure portal. If you want to create a new instance of a Data Factory, you can do it the same way you do with pretty much anything in Azure. Just go in here and click on create a resource. You'll find Data Factory under integration. So if you click on that, at least currently it's the third step down. Or you can just, as with anything else, you can just type in Data Factory in your search box and select it from that. But I will not, I won't go through all the steps of creating one. I've got one already created here, so just go ahead and click on that one. So when you access your Data Factory instance on here, you get a very familiar screen if you're familiar with Azure. This lets you set some of the configurations. But if you want to actually do anything in Data Factory, what you need to do is open the Data Factory Studio, which is the user interface here. So you just click on that, it opens up a new tab. It just takes a minute here to bring up the interface. All right, we'll start by walking through the Data Factory interface. So when you get back here, there's the Home tab, which gets you to this screen right here. I'll show you some various parts of it where you can see some of the things you've worked with recently. Also, some of the things, showcasing. It's very familiar screens to anybody who's worked in Azure portal for pretty much anything. There's a lot of good videos and tutorials down here for learning about Data Factory and various things. So the home screen, so that's the home screen. The author tab, where you can come in and edit your various resources within Data Factory, whether it be pipelines, data sets, your data flows and so forth. Power query and templates are something that's kind of beyond the scope of this discussion. I won't cover them here. Those are just some more advanced topics. The monitor screen, where you can monitor either currently running or previously run instances of your pipelines. And it'll store up to generally about 45 days, 30 to 45 days worth of history. It won't go back any further than that, though. So if you need to resolve issues or monitor things, just make sure you're keeping an eye on that from time to time because the data only goes back so far. But you can also monitor various subsections of that. So, if you want to see actual pipelines, we'll talk about triggers in a minute. If you want to, filter it down by the various, which ones ran in various integration runtimes, you can use that, that kind of thing. Some other thing, the rest of these are things that are kind of, again, advanced topics that are beyond the scope of this one. And I'll show you some examples of the monitoring here in a minute. Then there's the Manage tab where you can edit and configure things. So one of the things to remember is that Data Factory can be tied to a Git repository. If you want to store your pipelines, do versioning, that kind of thing with your code. Basically, a pipeline is stored as a JSON file. So everything that you configure in the screen, it gets saved into a JSON file. And there's one JSON file for each instance, or for each resource, whether it be a pipeline, a data flow, whatever it might be, a link service. They're all stored as JSON files, essentially. And your Git repository, if you'd like to connect Data Factory to a Git repo, will store all that for you. And you can do things like branching. You can do, deployments, CI/CD deployments, moving from environment to environment, all that kind of stuff. Again, that's beyond the scope of this discussion, but just know that you can store, all of your work in a Git repo and keep it versioned and keep it up to date. But under the screen here, and that's under the Git configuration, but under the screen here, you can edit your link services, your runtimes, purview, something that's beyond, again, more advanced topic. And then one of the things I haven't mentioned up to this point is triggers, really. So there are two ways that you can cause a pipeline to run. So you can either use one of the triggers that are built into Data Factory, and there's two basic types of triggers. There's a schedule trigger, so something will run on a regular schedule. And then there is what's called a file trigger, essentially. But that's something where, a file gets created in your Azure Blob storage, and you can cause the trigger to run based off of that. And then you can trigger pipelines from external calls. So maybe you want to have a process that calls a web API, and that kicks off a Data Factory pipeline, or an Azure function, or a logic app, or something like that, or a flow. You can use all kinds of things to trigger a pipeline from an external source or an external application. So you're not limited to just the built-in triggers that are the schedule and the file triggers. If you have any global parameters, things like that, you can store some of those in here. You can also update your security information. Let's go back to the author screen from now. So you can expand these. You can create subfolders, to structure them logically. Group things together that are related into subfolders. So if I wanted to, create a folder, and maybe I want to put all my SQL Server based pipelines together, I can do that, and then I can create a new pipeline within there. So let's go ahead and minimize that for the moment. So this is your basic interface. So the first thing you do is you'll see this pop-up come over here on this, and you can give your pipeline a name. So we'll say, you can put spaces in the names, but you just can't end it with a space or an underscore. But spaces and underscores are the only special characters that you can use. Let's just call this Azure SQL Demo. Okay, so this button here is show you the JSON representation of the code. You can actually edit quite a bit of it in here. One thing you can't change, though, from the JSON is the name. I'm not sure why that is the case, but even if you saved it, even if you're coming back to it later, if you published it, it just doesn't let you rename it under the JSON editor. But pretty much anything else you can edit in here. And then, for instance, even the folder here, I can do that. Then you come back here and you can see the folder's been named. I don't know why you can rename that, but you can't rename the actual pipeline itself under here. But that's just the way it's set up. But if you want to do, for instance, updates, for instance, if you don't have a CI/CD pipeline set up and you want to update the version from maybe your dev environment to a test environment, you can just take a copy of all the JSON from one work area and then just paste it in here and then save it and publish it. And you can make the updates that way. Just the only thing you can't change is the name by that method. The only way to change the name is to change it here in this screen, the properties screen. So let's walk through some of the various activities that you can do. So it starts with the move and transform. So I talked about the two basic activities. There's the copy data, which lets you just do a simple copy of or manipulate or movement of data from one place to another. And then data flow for the more advanced manipulations. If you're doing anything with Azure Data Explorer, you can do that. You can access that here. If you want to call an Azure function, you can do that here. You can do custom batch jobs, various things, and that's a more advanced thing that I won't get into here. If you're working with Databricks or Data Lake Analytics, you can still access those from here. So most of the general things, so you can work with variables, you can call stored procedures, you can do lookups, which lookups basically let you look into the data from a previous activity. So maybe if you have a copy step and you want to look at the first row of data in that copy step to maybe say, okay, this data belongs to this company or this data belongs to this application. So you can do various steps and things based on a lookup. Get metadata lets you look into some of the properties of a file if you're manipulating a file, or if you're basically that's looking at information about the link service or the data set itself, as opposed to the data that's in that data set. If you want to force a pipeline to fail, you can call fail step. You can call another pipeline from a pipeline. So there are limits to the number of activities that you can have in a pipeline. I believe it's 50 steps total, or 50 activities total. But what you can do is you can call another pipeline. So if your pipeline needs to be more complex than that, you can just call into another pipeline from this one. Another good reason to use that is to do refactoring. So if you have a common set of logic that's going to be used across multiple pipelines, then you want to refactor that out into a pipeline of its own, so you're not having to redo edits across a bunch of different pipelines if you change how you're doing something. If you want to delete a file, you can use a delete. Again, data manipulation. Scripting lets you call various scripts. You can do some data validation. There's also calls to web APIs via the web and the webhook. So the difference between the web and the webhook is that one of them is an asynchronous call, so it's basically fire and forget. And then there's webhook, which it waits for results. So web, if you want to do a fire and forget, so maybe you just need to call and send out a notice or a notification or just pass some data off, and you don't care about the response to that, then you can call web, or you can use the web activity. If you need to get information back, so maybe you're calling a web API and you're getting data, you'd use a webhook. And then if you want to force a pipeline to stop and wait for a while, you can use a wait step. I'm not going to cover HD Insights. Data Factory lets you do various things with iterations and conditionals. So if you need to filter data, get a subset of the data that's coming out of a previous copy. If you need to loop through things with a for each, you can use if conditions and switches and do untils. And those work basically the same ways that they work in just about pretty much any programming language. And then machine learning and Power Query, again, those are more advanced topics that I won't go into here, but you do have access to be able to look at your, some of your machine learning stuff that comes out of Azure Machine Learning. Again, those are more advanced topics there. So those are the basic activities that you have access to. And doing or creating a pipeline is very simple. You just click on it and drag it in. So you can do, depending on the activity that you're dragging in, you'll have various configurations down here at the bottom. So you can give your activity a name. So say copy SQL data. If you want to add a description, you can. Timeout will let you define how long it'll wait for the activity to stop. So there are maximums. You can see this notice here that they've changed the default to 12 hours. It used to be 7 hours default activity. And any activity that you've created previously, if you've created stuff in the past, will still have that default 7 hours. But this is only for new activities. But if you need to make it wait for more time or less time, you can change that timeout here. You can do automatic retries and an interval between retries. So if you want to say, okay, I'm going to call out to a web API, and if it fails the first time, I want to try at least 2 or 3 more times. So say I want to do 3 retries, and I want to wait for 90 seconds in between each retry. So maybe a server's offline or something for a while, you want to give those automated retries. If you leave it at the default 0, it will not retry. If it fails the first time, it fails the pipeline. For a copy activity, you're going to have two endpoints essentially. So you have your source, which is where the data is coming from, and then you have your sink, which is where the data is going to. So for source, so maybe I want to use a database table here, which I've got a link service or a data set actually already defined for that one. It's coming from a table of worker data that I pulled out of a CRM instant or an ERP. So basically this is just doing a table query against that SQL Server table. And it's got a timeout. There's a timeout of 120 minutes, but it's a small table. But for that, that query, you could set timeouts. If you need to add additional columns, so maybe you want to maybe you have a static column. You're going to say default greeting, and you want static data of hello. So basically this is going to add a new column to each row in the output. It's going to be called default greeting. It's going to have the data of hello in it. So you can do things like that. So that's basically if you're adding things, or if you want to do a concatenation between two tables or something like that, or two columns in the table. Any kind of simple manipulations, you can add additional columns here and just add them on to the output. So when it goes from the source to the sink will actually receive this additional column in addition to the data that's already there. This would be a good place to introduce you to the dynamic content editor. So if you want to do something like, as mentioned, the concatenation of a couple of columns together, what you can do is you can click add dynamic content, or you can click on the blue box there. And it gives you access to a number of things. So for instance, if you have parameters that are being passed in, you have access to those. If you have access, or if you have system variables that have been defined. So say for some reason you wanted to add in the pipeline name, or the run ID, the trigger ID, those kinds of things that have been defined as automatically defined when you run the pipeline. If you want to call a function of various kinds, so maybe I want to do that concatenation. So I'll say concat. If you click on the function, you'll see it pop up here. At that point, you can add other information like variables, parameters that you save, variables that you save, whatever it might be. Then you can add that there. In this particular case, so let's say that I have in my pipeline, I've defined two variables, and those get some step before that defines those two variables. Maybe I just want to include those both in the output. So I can come in here to the functions, say, concatenate, then I can come over here and I can do variables var a, and you can either click on that or you can type it in yourself if you know the access. So in this particular case, I've creating an output column called default greeting, and basically the output is including concatenation of those two. I mean, you can do any kind of manipulation. So in this particular case, I've got a couple of input variables that have been sorted in my pipeline, and and I'm setting those as part of the or I'm putting those into a column that gets added to every row, the concatenated output of those. Now, one of the things, if you want to manipulate columns of data from the source, you can't do that here. You would have to use a data flow in order to manipulate those columns and add them. Say if you wanted to create a calculated column that comes out of a couple of input columns, you would have to do that in a data flow. You can't do that in the simple copy activity. So as part of the pipeline, if you want to be able to define those parameters, you've got those variables here, and you can set that there. So here you can see I've added these two string variables called var a and var b under my variables. And you have, like I mentioned, you have various steps through here where you can define variables or manipulate them, change them around, whatever it might be. And then, if you want to pass parameters into your pipeline, either from an external source or from another pipeline or as part of the trigger, you could define those here. So let's say maybe I've got, maybe I want to pass in what the name of the folder is that I want to get a file from. So I just, create a string folder here. Then maybe what I can do is do a set variable step up here in front. drag that success. So I'm going to set my variable var a. Maybe I want to set var a to some input folder. Maybe it's the source folder that gets passed in. So I can say, my variable becomes my parameter becomes my variable. And then maybe what I want to do instead of just that by itself is add something to it. So concat, source folder, and then maybe I want to put into a source or a subfolder called archive. And maybe I want to use that at some point to copy the data into a destination file, make a copy of it into an archive folder. That's a very common part of pipelines. When you're working with files being passed back and forth, you want to keep a copy of the file as it came into the pipeline, and also another copy as if you did any manipulation to it, keep a copy of it after it's been manipulated and right before you pass it on to the destination system. So that's a very common thing to do with Azure Data Factory, is to create these archives of files so that you can go back and look at the original source data, look at the data after it's been manipulated, in order to be able to access that, or to be able to see what might have happened to it. So that helps you to debug if there's issues and things like that. So that's a very common usage for copy activities for data variables and parameters, things like that. Then for the sync, you would set it up the exact same way. So there are various ways that you can do, the sync when it's writing out. Do you pass that data to a stored procedure? Do you do an upsert or an insert? Do you want to do a table lock? Again, these things and these configuration settings will change based on what your source and your sync data type is. So if I were to be doing this to a flat file, so say if I change this to a fixed width file, you'll see that the configuration options change. And based on what your source and your sync are and how you're manipulating the data, you may have to do custom mapping. So if you want to force data into a certain format, you can change the mapping, or say maybe the column names are different. Even if you're just going from a database table to a database table, if everything is the same between the two tables, you don't need to do any mapping. It'll just automatically figure out what the mapping should be based on the column names. But if you need to manipulate things, if you need to do some customization things, maybe the column names are different from one to the other, then you'll have to come in here and manually configure the mapping. And that's fairly simple. So, just say, maybe I want to map my configuration or my execution ID, and it hasn't, you can import the schemas. So in this particular case, they're all the same. So if I were to force the mapping, you can see they're all just the same straight across. But like I say, if you want to customize that, you can do that here. Settings, you don't really need to know much about these. Almost always will leave these at the defaults. Then if you have any custom user properties that you need to work with, again, that's a more advanced topic that I won't go into here. But you can manipulate that here. And really, that's all you need to do. If your pipeline is just this one step, you can just click save. And then if you want to test it, you can do a debug. So you run it through here. But if it's to the point where you're ready to use it in real time, whether it's test environment, production environment, the last step, once you're done editing your pipeline, is you need to publish. Until you publish a pipeline, those changes are not live in the integration runtime. Like I say, you can run them locally using the debug, but until you publish it, the integration runtime won't run the newest version of your pipeline. And publish is very simple. I mean, just basically when you click publish, it'll say, okay, I've got all, and obviously I've got a bunch of errors here. So one of the things it'll do is when you click publish, it actually will validate first. And you can do validation manually if you want to. But one of the things it'll do is it'll look at all of the pipelines that you've created that have not yet been published, or all the resources even that have been created that have not yet been published. And it'll show you any errors. So sometimes they're just warnings. There's things like, hey, you might want to fix this. And sometimes there are things like in these instances where you can't actually publish it until you fix the errors. but it's fairly simple. So all you have to do is click on one. It'll take you to the activity where that error is occurring, and then you just fix it. So in this particular case, you can see the link service hasn't been selected, stored procedure name hasn't been selected, so it doesn't know what to do. So we can go ahead and close that. If there were not any errors, then what it would show you is a list of resources that have changed, and then you just click the publish button and it'll make those changes live. It'll publish them out to your server. One of the things to remember is that every time you click save on a pipeline, it will save those changes to your Git repo. So that's something that's important to remember. It's the same as doing a check-in and a push in Git. That's essentially what it does. It does a check-in and a push to save your latest updates to that JSON file. So you can see here is a more complex example that I've created. So here maybe I'm doing a lookup on some data. Here I'm doing a copy activity, and you can see you can have various pathways through things. So in this particular case, the set variable step doesn't happen until both of these have completed. Again, with this execute pipeline 1, as soon as this one is done, it'll run. But execute pipeline 2, it has to be both of these that have completed successfully. And you can see with each of these outputs or these steps, there are 4 different kinds of pathways that can be taken after a activity has completed. So green means on success, red means on failure. So in this particular case, if execute pipeline 2 fails, it'll call this stored procedure. Otherwise, it will go to data flow 1. And as long as this one is also completed, then data flow 1 will execute. There are blue steps here, which means on completion. So it doesn't matter whether it passed or failed, as long as this step here has completed. Whoops. As long as this step here has completed, then it will carry on the next activity. And then the 4th type here is skipped. So if for some reason an activity was skipped, then it'll go on to the next step. I've never really had a reason to use skipped at this point, but it's there as an option. And just kind of what I showed you here on accident a second ago. Anytime that an activity is accessing something external, so in this case a data flow or something that has a separate editor, or here these are calling additional pipelines. If you click on this, or if you double click on the box, or if you click on this, it'll take you to the editor for that activity. So in this particular case, you can see it opened up a new tab, and here I could edit this data flow. Or here, I haven't defined the pipeline, so it doesn't actually go to a different one. But say if I were to say Barrett call as my pipeline, then I click on that, then it'll take me to the editor for that data flow or for that pipeline. So that's kind of a more complex example. I have created some pipelines that go into dozens or even hundreds of steps, and I've had to break them down into sub pipelines and refactor that out. But in general, this is a fairly common level for, at least in my experience, for the number of activities that you might see in a pipeline. Anything beyond a simple file copy. So just a couple of other simple examples. So for instance, in a for each, if I had, as I had data pass into here, it'll execute these sub activities. So here you can click on that and say, okay, so for each item or each data, maybe it might be a list of files. It might be the rows in a table or whatever it might be that it's iterating through. For each of those, it'll call this pipeline. So let's look a little bit closer at a data flow. Here we've got a SQL data source. You can set various options. So schema drift, you would use that if, for instance, the file structure changed, like maybe they added additional columns at the end of the CSV or whatever it might be. If that's checked, it'll accept that. It'll say, okay, I can use these even though I don't necessarily know what these additional columns are because they weren't there at the original definition. We're not going to worry too much about it in that particular case. So if this check mark was not there and the file structure did not exactly match what was expected in Data Factory, that would throw an error. For infer drifted column types, it Again, it's the same thing. If you're allowing schema drift, it'll try to figure out what those additional columns are. And then validate schema. If you've defined what the schema is in here, it will do that to verify that the schema hasn't changed in the file or the database table or whatever it might be. And again, depending on what your source is and what your destination is, you'll see different options under these configurations. In this particular case, because this is a SQL Server table, you can do it back. You get the rows in batches. You can do whatever it might be. Projection is kind of a look at the schema. If you need to change that, you can do overwrite and force it to change the schema into certain things. So maybe it thought that this is an integer, but it actually should be a string. You can override that and force that to be a string. So inspect, again, it just kind of lets you look at what the output's going to be. So this particular schema, this data source has 19 columns, and these are what the types are. And then if you want to do data preview, I would have to spin up a debug instance to look at the data, but you can look at a sample. It'll show you like the first 20 rows or 50 rows or whatever it is of the data that might be coming in. So right now would be a good time to take a look at how you could do things like calculated columns. So if I go over here to this derived columns, which is the second step in this data flow, you can see that I have created an additional column called merge dates, which basically is taking the valid from and valid to dates out of the SQL source data and combining them together into an output string. So just take a look at that. So your derived columns will basically add additional columns to the original data source set. So you're telling it where it's coming from. So in this case, it's coming from the SQL data source. And then you can add additional columns down here. So let's take a look at this one here. So if I click on that, then you can see this open expression builder. So expression builder is where you're going to create those manipulated columns or those constructed columns. So go ahead and click on the expression builder. There we go. And you can see it's very similar to the other dynamic constructor. The biggest thing you'll notice is that in the other dynamic functions in Azure Data Factory, you'll have an ampersand or an @ symbol in front of the formula. In this particular case, you don't. I'm not sure why. It's a little bit different. But again, here's an example of this concatenate. So I've got 2 date fields. I'm converting both of those to strings, and then I'm concatenating them together, and then I'm outputting them into a new column called merge dates. So you can do any kind of manipulation. There are a bunch of different functions, math functions, string functions that you can get access to. Various things. You can take input data from the input schema. You can bring it from parameters that are passed in. You can cache things and look them up later. And then there's some library functions and things, locals, things like that where you can create and use variables within the data flow itself. But the biggest thing, generally, most people you'll worry about is functions in the input schema. Those are the 2 biggest things. And you can create new columns, you can add columns, and you can also manipulate the output. So that's kind of a simple look at how to create those calculated columns that you might need for your output. So when you're done, you can click Save and Finish to save the updates, or Cancel, of course, to exit out. And then in this particular case, it's outputting a bunch of data into fixed width columns for a fixed width file. And you could do that same thing. Here we're padding data in the output. And then in your fixed width file, here you can define what's going out. So in this particular case, the output for this is just 3 columns, and they're fixed width columns. So you can control what goes in the output. Let's say you need to remove a bunch of data, or maybe you're only interested in 2 or 3 fields. You could either control that with the input, or if the case, with SQL, that's easy to control what your inputs are. If you're importing, say, for instance, a flat file or a CSV file of some kind, obviously you can't filter out what you're pulling in, so you need to filter it on the output. And in this particular case, you would do something like this, where you're only selecting certain fields to go into the output. So that's a simple look at a data flow. So that's really all that there is to creating an activity. So let's look at a monitor. what I want to do is simple copy activity here. Let's look at this one. I think this one, yeah, this is just copying from one workers table to a duplicate version of it. So I'll just go ahead and click debug. And what it'll do is it'll spin up an instance of the debugger. And then once that's ready, it'll run the activity. Generally, the first time, if you haven't spun up a debug instance in a little while, it takes a minute or two to get it running. All right, so you can see down here the logs of what's going on here. So you can see when the run started, how long it ran. So in this particular case, it ran for 8 seconds for this particular activity, and it failed. And you can also see the default integration runtime that's hosted in the cloud. It's always called auto resolve integration runtime. That's the default. In this particular case, it's failed. So you can actually come in here and look at the configuration while it's running. So if you have a question about, in this particular instance, I saw that the second one started to go, and you can see the third one's the third attempt, and I'd forgotten that I actually had set up retry attempts. So this will try up to 20 times with a 30-second interval in between each one. We're going to go ahead and cancel that though. So if you click in the empty space here, it'll take you back to this output screen so you can see the output of the runs. In this particular case, we're going to look at this. Failure happened on the sync side, so you can see what the error messages are. This will help you to debug things. Database operation failed. Can't insert a null value into column definition group. So in this particular case, there was null value coming out, and it's not acceptable. So when you're doing a debug, you can actually see the data, or that you can see the steps being run as it runs. Every run will have an ID if you need to go back and reference it later, or use that for running other things. But what I wanted to do is come out here and show you the monitor screen. So on the default screen here, you can see there's nothing here, but that's for triggered pipelines. If for ones that you ran as a debug, you click on debug, and now you can see this was the instance that ran. Here was that run ID. You can see what the name of the pipeline was that ran, when it started, when it ended, how long it was ran for. So in this case, it ran for 1 minute and 45 seconds before it was canceled. And it was triggered manually. If it came off of a trigger, for instance, a schedule, then it would show you the name of the trigger. So when you create a trigger, and I'll show you that in a second, it'll let you give that a name. In this case, it was canceled, so it doesn't actually show the error messages. But if it failed, you could actually reference the error message there. But in order to go back and see that other screen where you were seeing the logs from that run, you can just click on the name. It takes you to this screen, which shows you that logging instance. So for each of these activities, generally you'll see these two arrows, so like the input and the output, and then some, depending on what else or what type of activity it is, you might see some additional icons here for other information. So in this particular case, you can see that the logging information is also stored in JSON format for the most part. So you can see here, this was a copy activity. The source was Azure SQL source. The sync was Azure SQL sync. You can see that it was, here's a list of the mappings. So that schema mapping from source to destination, you can see what that information is for each of them. So, for the source and the sync. And then you can see some of the other settings that are in there. So for the output, you can see number of bytes read is 144,922. Data written was 0 because it was failing. You can see the number of connections, source and peak, the number of rows read, so it read 611 rows. The data time. And then a lot of times, in this particular case, there was an error message, so you can see that here in the logs as well. You can see which, information about the runtime that it ran on, and information about your billing. So, for this particular case, I was basically charged 0.06 units. That helps you keep, if you want to get that far into the depth, it helps you keep track of how much charge or how much you've been charged for this. You know, with as with many things in Azure, this is usage-based pricing for Data Factory, and it can get fairly expensive. It is definitely an enterprise option. It's not something you're going to want to use for, in most cases, not something you probably want to use for personal use or something like that, because it can get fairly expensive. But then Data Factory is generally intended to be used for enterprise level data. So, you know, huge data, big data, um, gigabytes and terabytes of data is where Data Factory excels. You know, if you're moving small amounts of data, you know, a few records at a time or whatever it might be, I would probably recommend that you use Flow or Power Automate rather instead of Data Factory. You know, you can achieve a lot of the same things. And it's the same kind of interface, you know, the drag and drop, connect things together. And actually, you know, Power Automate has connections or has a larger number of external connections to various systems. But you know, Power Automate is not good for huge amounts of data. It's fairly slow and cannot handle, you know, huge files or millions of records of data. Whereas Data Factory can easily handle millions of records at a time. And you know, that's what it's intended for. So, you know, again, integration runtimes, I only have the one runtime, but if I was to look at that and I could see, you know, is it running all right? What activities have recently run on that? In this particular case, it only shows you triggered events. It doesn't show you, you know, debug instances. And then, you know, obviously here, if something had been triggered by a trigger, I can see it there. So I want to come back in here, just show you how easy it is to add a trigger. So for instance, say I wanted this to run once an hour. You know, if I wanted to trigger now, I could just click trigger now. But if I want to create a new trigger, I just come over here and click new. Or actually, if I had existing triggers, you could have it a single trigger run multiple pipelines. So if I wanted to tie this pipeline to an existing trigger that I'd already set up, you know, maybe you've got pipelines that run, you know, you've got 10 different pipelines that all need to run at the same time on the same schedule. You could use a single trigger to kick them all off. But in this particular case, I'm going to create a new one. You give it a name. I'll just leave that at the default. You've got schedule, tumbling window, storage events, custom events. So basically schedule is, you know, whatever your schedule is. It might be every 10 minutes, every 10 seconds, once a day, once a week, whatever it might be. You can set up a schedule. Tumbling window is similar to schedule, except it won't overlap. So if you've got it set up to run every second and, you know, the previous instance ran for 5 seconds, tumbling window is one of the ways that you can prevent it from generating multiple instances at a time. Storage events, you know, if I want to do it on file create or on file deletion, those are your two options. And it's always tied to Azure Blob Storage. You know, that's the only storage resource that the storage events will work with currently. But in this particular case, you know, I just leave it as schedule, tell when you want it to start running. So if I want to set up a schedule to start next Tuesday, I can set the start date as next Tuesday. You set the time zone, recurrence. If I want it to run, say, every day. So depending on which one you set, you can set up some advanced ones. So say I want to run every day, but I want to run at 8, 9, 10, and then at 3, and it's 24-hour time. So say I want to run at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and then at 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. And then I want it to run at 15 minutes past the hour. So now you can see it'll run at 8:15, 9:15, 10:15, 15:15, 17:15. And if you only want it to run for a certain amount of days or to a certain date, you can specify an end date. And then, you know, whether or not, as soon as if I have start trigger on creation, if I click OK, it won't actually start because I haven't published it yet. So it's again one of those things where, and a lot of people who are getting used to getting used to Azure Data Factory will run into this, where They'll create something, they'll save it, and then they wonder why it's not running. That's because you haven't published it yet a lot of times. So you always got to remember that publish step. Let's go ahead and discard that for now. So I showed you the monitor. And again, link services, if I want to make changes to that, you can also see for each link service how many pipelines make use of that link service. So if I click on that, you can see, actually, sorry, how many data sets in this particular case. So I've got two different data sets that both use this Azure Blob Storage link service. Now I've got a separate database here, so you can see this particular case, I've got my two worker tables. There's that, and then, if you've created triggers, you can look at that. I mentioned global parameters before. But, that's really, all there is to it as far as a simple overview of Data Factory. Really, that's all there is to getting started with Data Factory. It's very simple, very easy to get started. And, picking up the basics is very, very easy. Like I said, it's a drag and drop interface. It's very, very simple to get yourself up and running and to get those first few steps out of the way. But then like I said, there's a lot more that you can delve into. It can get a lot more complicated, especially when you start dealing with, merging data between various sources or splitting data out into different destinations with, with the advanced data flows, or working with various things. The number of data sources that are out there that you can access there's quite a few. So, for instance, here, if I want to go in and say I want to pull data from, let's click new here. So here you can see a long list of data sources that you can access. It might be Redshift, S3, Blob Storage, Cosmos DB, Data Explorer, MySQL, Maria, Postgres, file storage, Synapse. Obviously, a lot of it's tied to various Azure data sources, of course, but you can also connect into a bunch of different things: Couchbase, DB2. If you're working with Dynamics, you've got Dataverse, and then of course direct Dynamics links. If you want to go to an FTP server, that's something that's very frequently used with a lot of the clients that I work with. Is transferring files back and forth between the client FTP or systems, and then the external vendor, FTPs. Maybe it's moving purchase orders or sales orders back and forth between the client and their vendors, that kind of thing. FTP is very common there. HubSpot, I mentioned HTTP endpoints. So if you're calling a web API, you can connect into Jira, Office 365, and so on. There are not nearly as many connectors as there are for things like Power Automate and Logic Apps, but there is a lot that's built in here to Data Factory, and there are a lot of opportunities for that kind of stuff. If you have something where there isn't a built-in connector for Data Factory, but there is something for Logic Apps or Power Automate that might work, then you can make use of one of those, maybe bring it into Azure Blob Storage as a file, and then use Data Factory to pull that file of data in. That's one way to do it. There are a lot of other ways that you can manipulate things and move stuff back and forth. So that's it. If you have any questions, obviously it's not an interactive session, but if you have any questions, you can reach me on Twitter at Barrett Blake, or I've got my blog site, barrettblake.dev, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You've got my addresses up there, and I'm happy to provide any answers that I can. As long as I've got time to reach out and help, I'm glad to do so. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your attention.